The red and blue lights hit your rearview mirror just as you pull into your driveway. Your heart rate spikes instantly. You shut the engine off, step out halfway, and before you can even process what's happening, the officer is already walking past the giant "No Trespassing" sign mounted beside your garage. Maybe you put that sign there for solicitors, maybe for strangers, maybe because you're tired of people wandering onto your property at night. But now a police officer is ignoring it completely, moving deeper onto your land like the sign doesn't even exist. And that's the moment a lot of people freeze. What would you personally do if an officer ignored your "No Trespassing" signs and kept approaching your property anyway? Have you ever experienced something similar during a traffic stop or police encounter? Tell me in the comments, because a lot of drivers think they know the answer to this situation until it actually happens in real life. And stay with me, because later I'm going to explain the one mistake people make when they try to assert their rights too aggressively on private property, and why that mistake can quietly give officers exactly the opening they were looking for. Now here's the thing most people misunderstand about "No Trespassing" signs. They think the sign creates some magical invisible force field that law enforcement cannot legally cross. That is not how this works in the real world. Not even close. A "No Trespassing" sign absolutely matters in many situations. It can strengthen your expectation of privacy. It can establish boundaries for private citizens. It can become relevant later in court depending on where the officer went, why they went there, how far onto the property they moved, and whether they had lawful justification. But the sign itself does not automatically stop police from approaching your front door, walking up your driveway, responding to calls, conducting investigations, or attempting what courts often describe as a "knock and talk." That misunderstanding gets people emotionally worked up fast. They see the sign ignored and immediately jump into confrontation mode. Can't you read? You're trespassing. You have no authority to be here. And sometimes the officer says nothing at all. That silence alone makes people angrier because now they feel ignored on their own property. But this is where psychology matters more than most drivers realize. Officers are constantly evaluating behavior during encounters, not just words. Timing, tone, body language, emotional escalation, sudden movements, refusal patterns, eye contact, hand placement. Whether someone appears nervous, confrontational, intoxicated, evasive, or overly rehearsed. And here's the uncomfortable truth nobody likes admitting. Sometimes people accidentally transform a manageable interaction into a suspicious one because they become emotionally consumed with proving the officer wrong. That does not mean surrender your rights. It means understand the battlefield before you start swinging. The simple phrase I want you to remember is this: "Officer, I do not consent to any searches or entry beyond what the law allows." That's it. Simple, calm, clear, non-threatening, not screaming, not chest-puffing, not trying to sound like a courtroom lawyer from the internet. Because the second people start reciting giant memorized speeches from social media videos, officers often stop hearing the substance and start focusing on behavior instead. And behavior drives decisions during roadside encounters more than people think. Now let's slow this down, because this gets complicated fast. Imagine you pull into your driveway after a late-night traffic stop. The officer activates lights just before you park. That matters. Timing matters enormously. If the stop legally began on a public roadway before you entered private property, the officer generally does not lose authority simply because you made it home. A lot of people wrongly believe crossing onto private property suddenly terminates the stop. It usually does not. So now the officer walks up your driveway despite the signs. This is where people often sabotage themselves. They step out immediately. They start filming aggressively. They begin shouting legal terms they barely understand. They refuse basic commands instantly. They close distance with the officer emotionally and physically. And now the energy changes. You can literally watch these interactions deteriorate in seconds. The officer's tone hardens. Backup gets called. Hands move closer to belts. Questions become sharper. Every movement gets scrutinized. Meanwhile, the driver thinks, "I'm defending my rights." But from the officer's perspective, they may now see unpredictability, escalation, and possible non-compliance. Again, fair or unfair, that's the reality of roadside psychology. One of the strangest parts of police encounters is that silence affects officers emotionally too. Most civilians don't realize this. When someone calmly refuses consent without hostility, some officers become more cautious because there's less emotional energy to feed off. There's no argument to push against, no verbal chaos, no ego battle. Officer, I do not consent to searches beyond what the law allows. Then silence. That silence is powerful if used correctly, but people struggle with silence, especially under pressure. The officer asks again, "You got anything illegal in the car? Why are you acting nervous? Why won't you answer my question? If you've got nothing to hide, why not cooperate?" This is where emotional pressure starts building. Most drivers are not prepared for repeated questioning. They think rights are like pressing a button once. In reality, officers may continue probing conversationally because conversation creates opportunities. Nervous people talk. Guilty people talk. Innocent people also talk too much. And sometimes innocent people talk themselves directly into deeper investigation. That happens more than people realize. A driver says, "I'm not drunk, I only had 2 beers. Now the stop changes direction. Or, "There's nothing illegal in the car except my friend's prescription pills." Now another issue appears. Or, "You can search if you want because I know my rights." That last one happens constantly. People challenge officers emotionally and accidentally consent at the same time. Words matter. Tone matters even more. Now let's talk about property specifically, because this is where myths explode online. People love saying, "If there's a gate and signs, police can never enter." Not necessarily. If officers have a warrant, exigent circumstances, hot pursuit, emergency concerns, or lawful investigative reasons under certain conditions, signs alone may not stop entry. Context controls everything. But there is a huge difference between silently allowing unrestricted movement and calmly asserting boundaries. That's why the phrase matters. You are not physically blocking. You are not threatening. You are not escalating. You are preserving your legal position while reducing confrontation. That distinction becomes critically important later if the encounter ends up reviewed in court, on body cam footage, or in an internal investigation. People forget cameras work both ways now. Officers know body cams capture demeanor. Prosecutors review behavior. Judges observe escalation patterns. Jurors react emotionally to tone. The calm person often appears more credible than the loudest person, even if the loud person technically understands parts of the law correctly. And here's another reality most viewers never hear. Some officers absolutely know people misunderstand no trespassing signs. They know certain phrases trigger emotional reactions. They know hesitation creates pressure. They know prolonged silence makes civilians uncomfortable. Why? Because traffic stops are psychological environments. They are not just legal environments. Think about the setup itself. Lights flashing, nighttime darkness, cars flying by, hands shaking, documents requested, questions repeated, long pauses, unexpected commands. The atmosphere alone pressures people into talking. Then add property intrusion fears on top of that, and people emotionally unravel fast. I've seen situations where officers simply stood silently beside a vehicle for several seconds after asking a question. No yelling, no threats, just silence. And the driver filled the silence themselves. That's how many investigations expand. Not through dramatic interrogations, through nervous volunteering. Now let's talk about another situation that catches people off guard. An officer ignores the sign and starts visually inspecting areas around your property without technically entering enclosed spaces. Looking through windows from lawful vantage points. Walking paths commonly used by visitors. Approaching detached garages. Observing vehicles parked outside. People often scream, "Illegal search," immediately. But the legal line between observation and unlawful search can become extremely fact-specific, depending on location, visibility, barriers, curtilage, implied access routes, and expectation of privacy. That's why emotional overreaction can backfire badly. If you start making threats or obstructive movements before understanding what's actually happening, you may unintentionally create entirely new legal problems unrelated to the original issue. And this is where that simple phrase becomes useful again, because it forces clarity without creating drama. Officer, I do not consent to any searches or entry beyond what the law allows. Notice what that phrase does psychologically. It communicates awareness. It establishes non-consent. It avoids amateur legal debates. It keeps emotional temperature lower. It avoids accidental admissions, and most importantly, it prevents people from oversharing under stress. Because once words leave your mouth during a stop, you cannot pull them back. Now here's something drivers rarely think about. Officers are also assessing whether someone is preparing for violence. That may sound uncomfortable, but it's true. Sudden movements toward waistbands, turning away unexpectedly, reaching into vehicles repeatedly, refusing visibility of hands, pacing aggressively, or closing distance rapidly can instantly change the officer's threat perception. And once an officer's threat perception changes, the entire encounter changes. Commands become sharper, tolerance decreases, physical control options increase. That shift happens incredibly fast. People sitting at home watching internet videos imagine they'll remain perfectly calm. But adrenaline does strange things. Fine motor skills weaken, voices crack, memory gets sloppy, anger rises unexpectedly. That's why rehearsed internet speeches often collapse under real pressure. Real control is simplicity. Short statements, calm breathing, slow movements, minimal unnecessary conversation. And yes, this includes passengers too. Passengers often make situations dramatically worse without realizing it. An officer is speaking with the driver and suddenly the passenger starts, "He knows his rights. You can't search this car. Why are you harassing us?" Now the officer's attention splits, threat perception rises, control of the scene weakens, backup may get requested. Passengers sometimes think they're helping when they're actually increasing uncertainty. And uncertainty is something officers instinctively try to eliminate. Let me give you a realistic example. Officer walks onto property despite signs after initiating stop nearby. Driver says, "Officer, you're trespassing." Officer ignores it and asks for license and registration. Driver becomes louder. "You're violating my constitutional rights." Officer asks driver to step out. Driver refuses immediately. "I don't have to do anything." Now tension rises. At this point, the original issue may have been minor, but emotionally, both sides are now digging trenches. The smarter approach? "Officer, I do not consent to searches beyond what the law allows. Am I being detained? And what is the reason for the stop?" Simple, direct. Notice there's no screaming, no pseudo-legal lecture, no physical resistance. People underestimate how much composure affects outcomes. Now let's discuss one dangerous myth that spreads constantly online. The idea that if police violate a boundary, you should physically prevent them from entering. That is extremely risky. Even if you later prove the entry was unlawful, physically interfering in the moment can escalate into obstruction charges, resisting allegations, use of force situations, or worse. Courts are where legality gets dissected safely. The roadside is where emotions and uncertainty collide in real time. That distinction matters enormously. Another thing people misunderstand is document retention during stops. An officer may hold your license and registration while continuing questioning. Drivers often feel trapped psychologically because they know they cannot realistically leave without their documents. And officers understand this dynamic too. Sometimes the stop feels conversational, even though practically speaking, most people do not feel free to terminate the interaction. That grey area creates confusion. Drivers begin wondering, am I detained? Can I leave? Why are they still asking questions? Why is another unit arriving? Meanwhile, the officer may be observing reactions more than listening to answers. People who become overly eager to prove innocence sometimes create suspicion accidentally. Rapid talking, unnecessary explanations, over-friendly behavior, forced laughter, constant movement. Officers are trained to observe baseline behavior shifts. They notice when someone suddenly changes tone after certain topics arise. For example, any weapons in the vehicle? Watch what happens to breathing, eye movement, hand position, response delay. These things matter during stops. And when people feel their property rights are being ignored simultaneously, emotional leakage becomes even stronger. One subtle mistake drivers make is turning encounters into ego contests. The officer says, "Mind if I take a look around?" Driver replies, "You need probable cause and a warrant according to subsection blah blah blah." Now the interaction becomes performative instead of practical. You don't need a lecture, you need clarity. "I do not consent to searches." That's enough. People think longer speeches sound smarter. Usually they just create more conversational openings. And remember this, Officers sometimes keep talking because people eventually crack conversationally. Silence feels uncomfortable to most humans, especially during authority encounters. That discomfort causes volunteering. Well, there is a legal firearm. Well, my cousin borrowed the car. Well, I was speeding because... Every extra detail creates possible investigative branches. Now let's go deeper into why officers may ignore no trespassing signs during investigations. From law enforcement perspective, officers often view approaches to front doors, driveways, and common access paths as areas where ordinary visitors could reasonably go. Courts have historically allowed certain limited approaches under implied license concepts. But where that implied access ends becomes highly fact-dependent. Locked gates change things. Fences matter. Posted warnings matter. Restricted pathways matter. Time of night matters. Purpose matters. And officers know this terrain is legally complicated, which is exactly why your behavior should remain disciplined instead of emotional. The moment you become unpredictable, the focus can shift away from the original legal issue entirely. I've seen encounters where the officer's suspicion initially seemed weak, but the driver's escalating behavior practically invited deeper investigation. Why? Because humans interpret behavior emotionally. An officer thinking, why is this person so reactive? Why are they pacing? Why are they shouting immediately? What are they afraid I'll discover? Maybe the person is simply angry, maybe scared, maybe misunderstanding the law. But perception during stops matters enormously. This is also why body language can either calm or inflame situations. Slow, visible hand movements, facing the officer directly, avoiding sudden reaching, speaking evenly. These things lower uncertainty, and lower uncertainty often lowers escalation risk. Now here's a part almost nobody talks about. Some officers deliberately use conversational friendliness after tension rises. They soften tone unexpectedly. Hey man, just work with me. I'm trying to help you out. This doesn't have to be difficult. People often misread this shift. They assume danger has passed emotionally, so they begin talking freely. That's when admissions frequently happen. Stress decreases, guard drops, conversation opens, and suddenly the driver casually reveals information they carefully avoided minutes earlier. You have to understand the emotional rhythm of stops. Tension doesn't always stay high. Sometimes it drops suddenly. That drop itself can become psychologically disarming. Another overlooked issue involves passengers being questioned separately. Officer walks away from driver, approaches passenger side, asks where they're coming from. Passenger gives one answer, driver gave another. Now suspicion increases dramatically, even if the mismatch was innocent. This happens all the time. People forget small details differently under stress. And once officers perceive inconsistency, they often dig deeper. This is why preparation matters mentally before encounters ever happen. Not paranoid preparation, calm preparation. Know your rights, know your limits, know what you will and will not say. Because under adrenaline, people default to habits, not internet fantasies. Let's talk about silence for a second, because silence terrifies many people during police encounters. Officer asks, "Why are you nervous?" That question alone traps many drivers psychologically. If you deny nervousness too aggressively, you sound nervous. If you admit nervousness, officers may interpret it suspiciously. Sometimes the best response is minimal. "Officer, I'm choosing not to answer questions." Simple. People think silence automatically creates probable cause. It does not. But hostile silence combined with erratic behavior can absolutely increase scrutiny. That's the nuance internet debates often ignore. Calmness matters. And here's another thing viewers need to hear clearly. There's a huge difference between refusing consent and physically resisting. You can verbally refuse searches while still complying with lawful physical instructions. Those are not contradictions. Officer says, "Step out of the vehicle." Maybe you believe the order is unfair. Maybe you think the stop is nonsense. But physically resisting roadside commands often creates immediate danger that overwhelms the original dispute. You challenge legality later. You survive the roadside encounter first. That's not surrender, that's strategy. Especially because roadside legal arguments rarely end the way internet comment sections imagine. Now let's circle back to property rights, because this is where emotions run hottest. People feel violated when officers ignore signs. Understandably so. Home carries emotional weight. Privacy matters deeply to Americans. Property boundaries psychologically represent control and security. So when lights flash outside your home and an officer walks past your warning signs anyway, it can feel deeply personal. That emotional reaction is real. But emotional reactions also cloud judgment. The people who handle these encounters best are usually the ones who separate emotional outrage from tactical decision-making. They document, they observe, they remain calm. They avoid unnecessary admissions. They preserve objections verbally without escalating physically. That combination is far more effective than screaming constitutional slogans in a driveway. One important thing many viewers overlook is timing after the stop appears finished. Officer hands documents back. Most drivers relax instantly. But then comes, "Hey, one more thing." That phrase catches people constantly. Psychologically, once people believe they're free to go, their guard drops. They become conversational. Cooperative pressure increases. "Mind if I ask you something? You don't have drugs in the car, right? You wouldn't mind if I checked?" Drivers who confidently refused earlier sometimes suddenly consent here because the emotional intensity changed. That transition matters. You should always mentally clarify, "Am I free to leave?" And if you choose not to consent, keep the refusal calm and consistent. Not angry, not sarcastic, not challenging. Consistency itself communicates control. Now there's another uncomfortable truth. Some people provoke encounters intentionally because they want viral footage. They chase confrontation. They bait officers verbally. They escalate tone for performance. That may generate clicks online, but real-world roadside encounters are unpredictable. Ego-driven escalation can go sideways fast. Adrenaline, misunderstanding, fear, poor communication, darkness, fatigue, all of it mixes together. And once force enters a situation, nobody rewinds the moment cleanly. That's why the simple phrase works so well. "Officer, I do not consent to any searches or entry beyond what the law allows." You're preserving your position without feeding chaos. And notice the final part carefully. Beyond what the law allows. That wording matters psychologically because you are not making yourself sound physically defiant. You are acknowledging legal process while withholding voluntary consent. Huge difference. Some officers may continue anyway, depending on circumstances. Some may pressure further. Some may become irritated. Others may remain professional and move on quickly. But your goal is not winning a driveway debate in real time. Your goal is avoiding unnecessary escalation while protecting yourself legally and practically. Because the roadside is full of tiny mistakes people never anticipated making. Nervous laughter, talking too much, sudden anger, reaching unexpectedly, contradicting passengers, over-explaining, confusing rights with resistance. And often the people most convinced they're prepared are the least prepared emotionally once authority pressure becomes real. That's why composure is everything. Not fake internet bravado, not screaming legal jargon, not trying to humiliate officers. Real composure. The kind that keeps your breathing steady while lights flash across your windshield. The kind that keeps your answers controlled when questions repeat 3 different ways. The kind that remembers silence can be more powerful than arguments. The kind that understands officers observe behavior constantly, even during pauses. Because sometimes, the most important moments during a stop happen in silence. The officer watches. You wait. The tension hangs there. And in those moments, people reveal far more than they realize.